The border region of southern Scotland has a strong history of sheep farming and shepherding. For many centuries this steep hill country and the productive valleys of in-by ground have been ideal for raising the many thousands of lambs that find their way to the lamb sales each fall. Some of these hills reach up to well over 2,000 feet above sea level, and for the 12 months of the year they are home for thousands of blackface and cheviot ewes. Even in the harsh winter months when only the valleys are spared from the sleet and snow, these ewes survive by foraging through these hill pastures, finding just enough to take them through to their April lambing. The shepherds and their dogs have remained the backbone of this hill country. Over the years, we have grown to know this area through the success that many of these shepherds have won with their dogs. Some may never have had the opportunity to travel through this marvellous countryside, but the familiar names of valleys and towns like Wiston, Ettrick, Peebles and Yetham conjure up a familiar picture of the origins of many famous dogs. These well-known dogs were later to become a strong part of the breeding lines of today's working dogs. The work of shepherding has changed very little over the years. It is a lifestyle that conjures up romantic ideas of freedom and a closeness to nature. Modern veterinary products have allowed for easier management and improvements in lamb numbers and quality. Today, the hill country of the southern uplands of Scotland continues to be a strong producer of high-quality lambs and breeding stock. It was fitting that the 1991 International Sheepdog Finals were to be held in an area steeped in such shepherding history. In 1990, the Supreme Championship was held just south of the Scottish borders, in the pastoral grounds of Alnwick Castle, the home of the Duke of Northumberland. It proved to be an exhibition of the strength of the Welsh team. Gwyn Jones and his 8-year-old Queen led the handlers into the final day, and a total of 7 Welsh handlers qualified for a chance at winning the Supreme Championship Shield. The most notable run of the 1990 trials at Alnwick would have been the high-scoring qualifying run that Gwyn Jones managed on the Friday. This run placed him with a lead over 30 points ahead of the second-place qualifying run of Wyn Edwards and Don. Gwyn's accuracy and ability as a handler went on to win him the highest score on the final day, winning him the 1990 Supreme Championship Shield. The young Scotsman, Alistair McRae, managed the second-place score with his 5-year-old Butte, with another Scotsman in third place, Joe McRobert with Glen. Fourth and fifth were won by the 2 Welshmen Wyn Edwards and Erwin Daniels. The high placings of the Welsh team gave them sufficient points to secure them the 1990 team trophy. The winners in the last 3 years of the International Championship had all qualified for this year's competition. In 1988, Marion Jones had taken the shield with Spot at Blair Athol. The following year, the trial was held at Margam Park in South Wales. With his high-scoring run at the end of the final day, Bobby Dyell and Wisp won the championship, leading the Scottish to another team win. And then in 1990, Gwyn Jones and his 8-year-old Queen went on to the winning position, and so this year's defending champion. And so, from the green and lush fields of Alnwick, this year's international travelled over the border to Carmichael in Lanarkshire, Scotland. For 1991, the 4 countries of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland were captained by their national winners. Julie Deptford, after her success in 1989 at Margam Park, had been absent from the 1990 trials at Alnwick. But this year she had gone on to win the Scottish National, and for the first time ever a lady handler was to lead the Scottish team into the championship. John Lightfoot, from the north of Wales, had managed to qualify 2 dogs for this year's international. His win at the Welsh National with his 7-year-old Black gave him the captain's position for 1991. Tommy Brownrigg, a hill farmer from Cumbria, won this year's English National with his 9-year-old Nap. Tommy has spent his whole life working hill sheep, and since he bought Nap at 9 months old, this partnership has managed to win some 36 Open Championship trials. Robert Gallagher made up the 4th captain at this year's finals. Robert farms Blackface and Texel sheep in the county of Londonderry, and with his 4-year-old maid managed to win the 1991 Irish National Champion at Wexford, and the captain's position for the Irish team at Carmichael. The qualifying trial for the Supreme began early on the Thursday morning. The first 32 handlers and dogs competed for an opportunity to run in the finals on the Saturday. The course, rules and scores for the qualifying trials were as follows. The gather of 400 yards could be taken on either side. Once the sheep were lifted, they were to be taken on a straight line to the handler, through 2 gates 7 yards wide and some 150 yards from the handler's post. If the gates were missed, no retry was allowed. The handler must remain at the post and finish the fetch by passing the sheep behind him onto the start of the drive. On the drive, the handler must remain at the post and direct his dog to drive the sheep 450 yards over a triangular course through 2 sets of gates, both some 7 yards apart. No retry at either sets of gates was allowed. The drive ended when the sheep entered the shedding ring. The handler must remain at the post until the sheep enter the shedding ring. In the shedding ring, 2 unmarked sheep must be shed off from the 5 sheep. This must be done within the boundaries of the ring, which is some 40 yards in diameter. The dog must be in full control of the shed sheep, and once the shed has been completed, the sheep had to be reunited before proceeding to the pen. Once the shed was completed, the handler must proceed to the pen, leaving his dog to bring the sheep to the pen. The handler must stand at the gate and must not let go of the 8-foot rope attached to the gate. Once the dog had worked the sheep into the pen, the gate must be closed. Once the sheep were released, the handler must then close and fasten the gate. The final part of the course was the single sheep. Here the handler returns to the shedding ring, leaving his dog to bring the sheep from the pen to the ring. One of the 2 unmarked sheep must then be shed off within the boundaries of the ring. Once shed, the dog must hold the single sheep to the judge's satisfaction. The handler was not allowed to assist the dog in wearing the single. The score for the qualifying course was 20 points for the outrun, 10 points for the lift, and then 20 points for the fetch. The drive was awarded 30 points, with 10 points for the shed, 10 for the pen, and then a final 10 for the single. This added up to a total of 110 points for each judge, and a grand total of 440 for the 4 judges. The time limit for the course was 15 minutes. On the first day of the qualifying trials, the handlers had the benefit of some fairly ideal weather conditions. The lay of the course meant that the sheep were in a northwesterly position from the handler's post. With the splendid hillside course, it allowed the best of visibility, with the lush green background of the September grass rising to the peak of the hill some 800 yards away. The second handler to run on this first day was Gwyn Jones, 1990's Supreme Champion at Alnwick. For 1991, he had qualified his 6-year-old Davidson's Kirk, a son of Gilds Tweed and D. Nichols Davidson's Jit. Right at the start of the first day, the sheep proved a force to the left-hand side of the course. Following a good but wide outrun, Gwyn had trouble keeping the sheep on line to the fetch gates. This persistent pressure from the fetch and drive line caused many handlers, including Gwyn, to lose valuable points earlier on in their runs. Gwyn went on to pick up points on the remainder of the drive and cross drive. At the start of the shed, one of the ewes broke out of the boundaries of the ring. Once the sheep were regathered, the shed was well taken, followed by a high-scoring pen, and then immediately taking the single sheep, for a final score of 334. Marion Jones is one of the most respected of sheepdog handlers in Britain today. He had qualified for this year's international with his 8-year-old Spot, the dog that won him the championship position at Blair Athol in Scotland in 1988. Spot had to be whistled out several times before arriving behind the sheep, but then went on to have a good lift and a high-scoring fetch to the handler's post. Once around the handler's post, points were lost with the ewes leaving the line through the gully on the first part of the drive. Soon after penning the ewes, and before he had time to take the single, the bell sounded for time. Joe McRobert and Cap were the fifth to run on the Thursday. By the time Joe had taken the shed, he had spent too much time trying to sort off the 2 unmarked sheep from the remaining 3. Up until the shed, they had managed a good run, losing points on the fetch with the sheep pulling off line, and again with the same problem on the first part of the drive. Once the shed was taken, time was running out for Joe and Cap, and right after he had finished the pen, the bell sounded for time, leaving him with a final score of 302. Hamish McLean, a farmer from West Hill in Inverness, ran his 8-year-old Lynn just before noon. Lynn is out of his own bitch, Joe, and sired by Lawrenson's Moss. The run started off with a good outrun and easily the best fetch so far on the first day. His work with Lynn on the fetch kept just enough pressure on the sheep to keep them on line through the gates and onto the handler's post. He went on through the rest of the course showing real accuracy and control. Some points would have been lost with the sheep running a little wide around the cross-drive gates before heading back to the shedding ring. The final sections of the trial, the shed, the pen and the single, were managed well. Hamish had an excellent run for a high score of 375. The highest scoring run for the English team on this first day was the early afternoon run of the Yorkshireman C. Cutler with his 9-year-old Sheena. Sheena was one of the 3 dogs to qualify for the International, of Bobby Dyell's well-known Dryden Joe. On the mother's side, she goes back to his own dog Sally. After a good outrun, points were lost on the fetch with the sheep coming offline, and then later on the cross drive when the ewes dropped low off the drive line to the second set of gates. He made up for it in the shedding ring, and then again at the pen, and then immediately taking the single, finishing up with a final tally of 305 points. Aled Owen has become a familiar face at these trials over the last number of years. In 1991 he had managed to qualify 2 dogs for the International, his 9-year-old Ben, the 1985 Welsh national champion, and then his 3-year-old Roy, off W.D. Jones's Mac, and out of Aled's own Lil. This was his first run on the Thursday with his 9-year-old Ben. Ben was sired by Edward Zack, and out of R. Williams Fan. Aled's score of 323 was much to do with his excellent drive, possibly the best so far in the trial. His misfortune on the fetch with the one sheep breaking away and having to whistle Ben out several times on the outrun lowered the score at the beginning of the run. He completed the course with a somewhat indecisive shed, but a good penning and single. Although Dennis Birchall, a farmer from Dunlavin, County Wicklow, was absent from the trial at Alnwick last year, he has been a regular and consistent competitor for the Irish team, and the winner of the International Brace Championship for Ireland in 1985. Dennis came to Carmichael this year with his homebred 2-year-old Jan. Jan took a good line on the outrun, which would have scored well. The fetch proved to be costly, with the sheep racing down the hill to the fetch gates. Once through the gates, the poor line to the handler's post would have reduced the already poor fetch score. Eventually, he ran out of time after a lengthy shed, and before he managed to either pen the sheep or take the single, finishing up with a total of 222 points. The next competitor, following Dennis Birchall, was Roddy McDermott from Argyllshire, Scotland, with his 4-year-old Cap. Cap's breeding goes back to S.N. Wilkinson's Cap and Lynn. Roddy's run here with Cap proved to be the second highest scoring run on the first day, with a total of 352, 13 points behind Hamish McLean's run earlier in the afternoon with Lynn. Most of his points would have been lost with a low line on the cross drive and then missing the cross drive gates before turning back to the shedding ring. Some time was also wasted in the shedding ring, and after a number of efforts managed to complete the shed to go on to a good penning and finally the single. Looking down through the list of breeders of the qualifying dogs at this year's trial, the names of John Templeton, Bobby Dyell, and this well-known figure from the sheepdog world, John Thomas, crop up fairly frequently. John Thomas is a native Welshman but shepherds near Cheltenham in Gloucestershire, in the southwest of England. Over the years, John has been a regular competitor at these international trials, and few handlers have equalled his success at both the national and international level. His well-known dogs, Craig and Don, have become a part of the breeding lines of many of today's border collies. At the English National this year, John managed to qualify his 6-year-old Joss for a chance at the Supreme Championship at Carmichael. Joss is a son of his own Dilwyn lad and is out of Barwell's Dell. After a good outrun, the sheep came offline on the last part of the fetch, missing the fetch gates and then working the sheep around the handler's post onto the start of a low-scoring drive. He finished the course well with a good shed and a clean penning, and before too long taking the single sheep. John completed the course for a score of 284. By the end of the first day, 32 dogs had run the qualifying course. Michael Shearer and Mist was the first to run. He had scored 323, with Gwyn Jones and Davidson's Kirk running second for a total of 334. The difficulties of the ewes pulling to the left-hand side of the course severely reduced many of the scores. Pat Burns Jr. managed 3:26 with his 6-year-old Dot, and Martin O'Neill, another Irishman, had scored a respectable 321 with his young 3-year-old Laddie. Hamish McLean with Lynn managed the first high-scoring run, and what was to be the highest score for the first day, with 375. Aled Owen, the Welshman from Clwyd, managed a 323 with Ben, whilst the Scotsman Roddy McDermott scored 352 with his 4-year-old Cap. Ken Bramer from Rosehall Leg ran in 28th position on the first day and just managed to reach the 300s with his 312 score. The handlers on the second day of qualifying were less fortunate with the weather. Although it didn't rain, the strong winds that blew across the course all day made some of the commands harder for the dogs to hear. Billy Elliott and his 8-year-old Gale were the third to run on the Friday. Billy shepherds the Holtburn farm near Yettham on the Scottish borders. His outrun and lift lost him very few points, but with the ewes still pressuring to the left-hand side of the course, he dropped nearly half of his points on the fetch. The sheep went well around the post and onto a good start on the first part of the drive. Problems in the gully slimmed down the points before managing the first drive gates. He then went on to a good cross drive and a high-scoring shed, only to run out of time at the pen. Dropping his points for the pen and the single only gave Billy a 275 score for the day. Raymond McPherson has competed for both England and Scotland in his years in sheepdog trials. Raymond is a transplanted Scotsman, now farming 1,400 Blackface and Swaledale type ewes on the Tarnhill Fell Range in northern Cumbria. Raymond's trial successes are numerous. In 1973, he competed in and won the first American World Trial Championship with Knapp of the White Oak Knapp breeding. He returned again in 1976 to the second World Trial, and this time managed to retain the championship, this time with Tweed. One of Raymond's most notable dogs on the trial field was his white-faced Zack, winner of the Supreme Championship in both 1975 and then again in 1979. This year, though, he competed with his 4-year-old gunner Katie, going back to his own Cap on the sire's side and then to Rutter's Fly on the dam side. The first part of his run was the most costly, with him whistling Katie on several times before reaching the sheep. With a nice lift, Katie brought the sheep down through the fetch gates on a fairly good line. From then on, his score improved, finishing with a top-scoring shed, pen and single. This gave Raymond a 359 qualifying score, easily enough for the finals. Tim Flood is one of the best known of the Irish handlers. Tim has won the Irish National Championship some 6 times, and then in 1988 with Pip, he went on to win the International Driving Championship. At this year's Irish National, he qualified his 5-year-old Dun, a son of his own Pip and out of Walsh's Mist.
Down, there's no flicker park there before he died. He said he can his place. He said it was 4 times a day or changed up that. He's dead now.
This run of Tim and Dunn dropped quite a few points on the outrun, fetch and drive. He had a high-scoring lift and pen, but dropped points again with both the shed and the single. He ended the day with a 288-point score. Johnny Wilson, with his 5-year-old Spot, was the next to run after Tim Flood and Dunn. Johnny shepherds near Ashkirk and has competed many times for the Scottish team. His 5-year-old Spot is a son of his famous Little Peg, the international shepherds champion in 1984, 1986 and then again in 1987. Spot's father was Raymond McPherson's cap. Spot lost some points with a wide outrun, stopping though in a good position behind the sheep. After a perfect lift, the ewes came offline and finally missed the fetch gates, dropping him a good part of his fetch points. His drive though was one of the best so far on the Friday, followed by a high-scoring shed and penning. Problems taking the single ran Johnny out of time, leaving him with a qualifying score of 323 points. Glyn Jones has competed for Wales on many occasions. His well-known Bwlch Taff won Glyn the Welsh National Championship in both 1980 and then again in 1981. This 4-year-old Taff is not of Glyn's own breeding, but is sired by Edwards Tweed and Roberts Judy. Glyn ended up with a score of 275, dropping 80 points from running out of time before completing the pen and the single sheep. In the early afternoon, Alan Leake competed with his 5-year-old Joe. Alan has had a lot of success with this dog, winning 10 top championships in the past 4 years. Allen farms near Penrith in Cumbria in the north of England. This 5-year-old Joe goes back to Mouse's Craig as a sire and Scott's Queen on the dam side. The start to this run had scored well. Joe took the highest scoring outrun on this day and then made a good precise lift. Unfortunately, things went wrong on the fetch with the ewes badly offline, although he did manage to get the gates. He scored well with the drive and cross drive, only losing 21 points out of the possible 120. Another 40 points dropped with the bell ringing before the single was taken. He ended his run with a score of 308 points. Julie Deptford came to Carmichael as one of the favourites for this year's championship. Julie was the first lady handler to win the Scottish National Championship, and as such, came to this trial as the captain of the Scottish team. In 1990, Wales managed to win the Team Shield, but out of the past 13 years, Scotland has managed to capture the Shield on 10 occasions. With the International in Scotland this year, there was the added pressure to claim back the Shield from Wales. Disaster struck for Julie, though, as the sheep bolted away to the left-hand side of the course, dropping 61 of the 80 possible points on the fetch. The drive was also costly, scoring only 33 points out of the 120. With more problems in the shedding ring, Julie will no doubt remember this trial, but not for the enjoyment. She ended the course with a final score of 154, after running out of time in the shedding ring, and so no score for the last 3 parts of the course. John Lightfoot had qualified 2 dogs for this year's final. Apart from Julie Deptford, John was considered a prime candidate for the title as well, after winning the Welsh National with his 7-year-old dog Black. John started the run with a good outrun and lift. The ewes were offline on the fetch and then caused some real problems on the drive. John managed to pull things back together again by the end of the cross drive and then back to the shedding ring. He went on to finish the course well, with a high-scoring shed, penning and single. His final score of 268 was a reflection of the problems in the fetch and drive, leaving him too few points to qualify for the final day. Tommy Brownrigg from the Lune Valley in Cumbria won this year's English National with his 10-year-old Nap. Together, Tommy and Nap have won some 36 Open Championships in the 9 years, and 3 captain's positions for England in total. Tommy, like other captains for this year, had some dismal luck. He started the run well, losing a few points on his outrun, but then having a grand fetch to the handler's post. He went on to lose about a third of his points on the drive, eventually running out of time on the single. His final score was just short of the 300 mark at 295. The end of the second day of qualifying, the final scores of the 57 runs identify the handlers and dogs that will have the chance to compete for the most coveted award in sheepdog trialling, the Supreme International Shield. Marion Owen ran his father's dog Rock in 4th spot on this second day. His was the first run to top the 300 mark with 323, and then immediately afterwards Raymond McPherson and his 4-year-old Katie managed a good score of 359. Johnny Wilson also scored 323 points with his 5-year-old Spot, a son of his well-known Peg. But it was a disappointing day for well-known handlers such as Glyn Jones, who scored 275 with Taff, and the well-known Irishman Tim Flood. Tim's score of 288 with his 5-year-old Dunn was off the mark for a chance on the final day. John Russell's score of 362 topped the qualifying points on the second day with his 6-year-old Scott, closely followed by John Brennan's 353 score with Dell for Ireland. Scotland is well known for its music, dancing and poetry. It has a cultural history as strong as in any country. These unique cultures continue today in the interests of many of the Scottish people. Apart from the bagpipes, the fiddle is recognised as one of the true Scottish instruments and is played by many of these folks in the pubs and dance halls of these country communities.
where the pools are bright and deep, where the grey trout lies asleep, up the river and o'er the lea, that's the way for Billy and me. Where the blackbird sings the latest, where the hawthorn blooms the sweetest, where the nestlings chirp and flee, that's the way for Billy and me. Where the moors mow the cleanest, where the hay lies thick and greenest, there to trace the homeward bee, that's the way for Billy and me. Where the hazel bank is steepest, where the shadow falls the deepest, where the clustering nuts fall free, that's the way for Billy and me. Why the boys should drive away little sweet maidens from the play, who love to banter and fight so well, that's the thing I never could tell. But this I know, I love to play, through the meadow among the hay, up the water and o'er the lea, that's the way for Billy and me.
At noontime, on the first 2 days of the competition, the qualifying trial is interrupted for the finals of the brace competition. Only 8 finalists qualify for the International Brace Championship, with 2 handlers representing each of the 4 countries of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. For 1991, the teams were made up by Pat McGettigan and Julie Deptford for Scotland, Tim Flood and Pat Burns Jr. for Ireland, John Griffiths and Jim Dyson for Wales, and Tim Longton and Thomas Longton for England. Out of the 8 handlers competing in the finals this year, 6 of them qualified for the finals in 1990 at Alnwick Castle. The trial at Alnwick proved to suit the young Irishman Pat Burns with his 2 dogs Star and Dot, as he went ahead to win the trial with a comfortable margin of 13 points over the second place run of John Griffith. John Griffith, representing Wales with Sam and Sweep, 2 dogs of his own breeding, competed last on the second day to score 397, with some 10 points ahead of Thomas Longton with Gem and Tweed. The course for the Brace Championship covers an outrun of 800 yards for 10 sheep. Each of the dogs has to take one side on the outrun, ideally reaching the sheep at the same time. Once the 2 dogs have reached the lift point behind the sheep, they are allowed to cross sides, but from that point on they have to remain on their sides and no crossing is allowed. Once they have reached the sheep, they must then be fetched in a straight line down the hill and through fetch gates set 9 yards apart. Once through the fetch gates, the sheep must continue in a straight line to the handler. At the end of the fetch, the sheep must be worked around the handler and on to the start of the drive. The drive covers some 600 yards. Here, the handler will direct the dogs to work the sheep around a triangular course and through 2 sets of gates, and finally back to the handler. The drive is finished when the sheep enter the shedding ring. Throughout this first part of the course, the handler must remain at the handler's post. The shed for the brace competition is quite different from that of the singles. Here, the 10 sheep have to be split into 2 groups of 5. This must be done within the boundaries of the shedding ring. Once completed, the group that is driven off is left with 1 dog, whilst the other group is penned in a diamond-shaped pen with an opening 5 feet wide and with no gate. Once the dog has worked the sheep into the pen, it must remain at the opening to prevent the sheep from escaping. Once the first pen is completed, the second group of sheep must then be regathered and penned in the second pen. The scoring for the brace finals is 40 points for the outrun, 20 for the lift and 20 for the fetch. There are 30 points awarded for the drive and 10 for the shedding. Finally, there are 10 points each for the pens, for a grand total of 140 for judge, and an aggregate score of 560 for the 4 judges. On the first day of the trials, it was Pat McGettigan with his 2 dogs, Sable and Todd, that took to the field first. Sable is a 5-year-old of Pat's own bitch Lee, and sired by Mackenzie's Don. Todd is also of Pat's own Jan, bred back to John Angus MacLeod's Taff, an 8-year-old dog that John qualified for this year's International. Pat is a crofter from Strathkyle, and has a gift with working brace. His successes are numerous, and in 1988 he won the Scottish National Brace Championship. The start to the run was excellent, losing no points on the outrun and lift for either dog. The fetch caused some real problems though, with the sheep pulling to the left side of the course. He managed a fairly good line down the hill to the fetch gates, but then narrowly missed the gates. This cost dearly. His drive scored well, and then he had an excellent shed. After managing the first pen, he ran out of time on the second pen, and so finished with a total score of 418 out of the possible 560. Tim Flood is a regular finalist in the Brace Championship. At Carmichael he ran his 5-year-old Dun and 7-year-old Flash. He also qualified for the singles with Dun, a son of his winning dog Pip, and out of J.P. Welsh's Mist. His other dog Flash ran in the Brace at Alnwick last year, and is off Tim's own breeding going back to his Flash and Mint. Tim lost a lot of points in the first part of the course. His shed and penning were the strongest part of his run, lifting his points to 351 for the day. The 2 other handlers that competed on the first day of the Brace Finals were John Griffith from the Snowdonia region of North Wales with Sam and Sweep, and Tim Longton from Quernmore with his 2 dogs Glenn and Becca. John Griffith lost a lot of his points at the start of the course, and then ending up running out of time penning the last group of sheep, ending up with a final total of 261. Tim Longton ran his 2 dogs Glenn and Becca for the English team. Tim is also a regular competitor at the Brace Championship. Last year he qualified with his 2 dogs Gel and Cap. At the start of the run, one of his dogs took an excellent outrun for a top score. His other dog, though, had to be whistled back a number of times, but eventually reaching the sheep some 800 yards away. He went on to have a good shed, and then major problems penning the first group of sheep. Time was called, and so there was no score for either of the pens. Tim ended up with a final score of 326. On the second day, Julie Defwood was the first to run in the Brace Finals. Julie not only managed to win the Scottish National this year, but also went on to win the Scottish Brace Championship as well. The 2 dogs that Julie won with were the mother and daughter team of 5-year-old Bess and 3-year-old Nell. Julie's score with this run ended up at 354. Points were lost with one of the outruns, with the first dog reaching the sheep well before the second. The fetch scored 54 out of the possible 80, with the driving score 57 out of 120. She had a top-scoring shed, and then went on to complete the first pen, running out of time on the second. The last to run in the brace finals was Thomas Longton with Tweed and Gem. This is the same pair that ran at Alnwick last year and placed in third position. Thomas scored well through the course, but then ran out of luck with one of the pens completed. Just as he managed to finish the second pen, the first group broke past the dog at the mouth of the pen, and so he scored no points at either pen. This brought Thomas's score down to 366, after having one of the best runs up until the end of the shed. The final scores for the brace finals were Pat McGettigan for Scotland with Sable and Todd winning with a 418. In second place was Pat Burns Jr., the defending champion, with 389 with his two dogs, Star and Dot. In third place was Thomas Longton with Tweed and Gem running for England, and then narrowly behind Thomas, Julie Defford through 354 with Bess and Nell.
271.
In the late summer and autumn months, sheep sales are a daily event throughout the region. The importance and size of the sheep industry only becomes obvious when reading through the listings of these auction sales in the local papers. The Lanark auction is just one of many that serve the surrounding farmers in southwest Scotland. Here the sales are run daily throughout the week, which each of these days identified for one specific class of livestock. On the Wednesday before the International, there was a mix of replacement grey-faced ewe lambs and store lambs. A total of nearly 30,000 lambs made up the day's numbers. The lambs started arriving early in the morning for the 11 o'clock sale. A number of the sorters and drovers helped with the job of finding the correct pens for the many sheep. Lambs of different shapes and sizes headed off from the unloading area, down one alleyway and up another until their correct holding pen was found. The ringing of the bell remains the traditional way of calling the buyers, sellers and onlookers to the start of the sale. And before too long the bids were being called, and one by one the pens of lambs changed hands from one farmer to another. Another important part of the fall auction sales are the ram sales. At some of the larger ram sales, such as Kelso and Builth Wells, as many as 10,000 rams will come under the hammer throughout the one day. When so many animals are being sold, as many as 30 rings operate continually on the one site. But not all of the ram sales are so large. The Hoyick sale of North Country Cheviot rams is one of the best known Cheviot sales in the country. This sale has a far more modest attraction, between 1 and 200 rams, but the quality of the rams sold here are of the very best. With the strength of the Scottish blackface and their mule replacements, the Cheviot over the last decade has suffered in its popularity. But there are still many farmers that consider the Cheviot breed as being a strong player on their farms. Their continued support leads to some aggressive bidding at Hoyick, with prices reaching well into the thousands of pounds. For the final day, the line-up of the 15 finalists were Michael Shearer with Mist, Gwyn Jones, Davidson's Kirk, Pat Burns Jr. and Dot, Norman Davis with Spot, Martin O'Neill and Laddie, Hamish MacLean with Lynn, Alid Owen and Ben, Roddy McDermott with Cap, and on the second day of qualifying, Marion Owen with Rock, Raymond McPherson with Katie, Johnny Wilson with Spot, Bobby Dial and Wisp, Wilf Reed with Sam, John Russell and Scott, and the 15th finalists, John Brennan and Dell. The course for the Supreme started with an outrun to the left-hand side of the field to gather the first group of 10 sheep some 800 yards away. Once the sheep are lifted, then they had to be brought down the course through the fetch gates and onto the post, 25 yards through the gates. The fetch gates were set 9 yards apart in the centre of the field. Once the sheep have reached the post, the handler then redirects the dog for the second group of sheep 800 yards away on the right-hand side of the course. Once the dog has reached the second group of sheep, they must be brought down the course and through the fetch gates. At this point, the first group of sheep should be regrouped with the second 10 sheep. Then the dog must bring the sheep onto the handler and around the post for the start of the drive. The drive is in 3 parts over a triangular course of 600 yards. The sheep will be driven away to the left of the course to a set of gates 9 yards wide. Once through these gates, the sheep will then turn for the cross drive. Once through the cross drive gates, the sheep must then be brought back to the shedding ring. If either of the gates are missed, no retry is allowed. The shed is made in a ring 40 yards in diameter. Once the drive has been completed, the 15 unmarked sheep will be shed off from the 5 marked sheep. This must be done in the boundaries of the shedding ring. If any marked sheep leave the ring and join any unmarked sheep, the marked and the unmarked sheep that they have joined must all be brought back into the ring for reshedding. Until the 15 unmarked sheep have been shed off, penning is not allowed. Once shedding has been completed, the 5 marked sheep must be driven by the dog to the pen, and then the sheep must be penned. The handler is not allowed to assist the dog in taking the sheep to the pen. The pen is 6 foot by 9 foot, to which a 6-foot rope is attached. Once the handler reaches the pen, he must stand at the pen holding the rope whilst the dog works the sheep into the pen. Once the ewes have entered the pen, the gate must be closed. The point score for the Supreme is 20 points for each outrun, 10 for each lift and 20 for each fetch. This gives a grand total of 100 points for the gather. The drive has a total of 40 points, the shed 20 and the pen 10. No points are awarded for either the shed or the pen when either of these parts of the course are not completed. The total score for the run is 170 and an aggregate for the 4 judges of 680. There is a 30-minute time limit. The forecast for the Saturday and the final runs called for a mixture of cloud and rain. Michael Shearer was the first competitor with his 4-year-old Mist. At the start of the run, Michael had to whistle missed out several times before reaching the sheep. This dropped him more than half of his outrun points. His lift and fetch both scored well, with the ewes coming down through the fetch gates before mist was redirected back for the second group of sheep. He lost nearly half of his fetch points with the second group of sheep, narrowly missing the fetch gates at the last moment. He scored well on his drive, arriving back at the shedding ring losing only 24 points out of the possible 160. His shed earned him the highest scoring shed in the finals, losing only 8 points out of 80, and then finishing up with a perfect scoring pen for a total of 527. Gwyn Jones came to the International this year as the defending champion. Gwyn has won many championship shields, going back to 1974 when he won the International with his Bill dog at the trial at Kilmartin. Bill was a son of the famous Whiston Cap. In 1976 he qualified for the International at Lockerbie, going on to win it with his dog Shep, a grandson of Whiston Cap. Last year's trial at Alnwick saw Gwyn leading the qualifying trial with a large margin with his 8-year-old Queen. This year he ran a different dog, Davidson's Kirk. Kirk goes back to D. Gild's Tweed, and on the mother's side, D. Nicholson's Davidson's Jit. Kirk took his second outrun immediately, but then Gwyn had to whistle Kirk out 3 times before he reached the sheep. This dropped him 35 points out of a possible 80. He then went on to a good lift and fetch. Once again he lost a lot on his drive, missing the cross-drive gates and only scoring 87 out of 160. Again he dropped quite a few points on the shed, and then ran out of time on the pen, finishing with a score of 369. Ireland managed to qualify 3 handlers for the last day. The first of these to run was Pat Burns Jr. with his 6-year-old Dot. Dot is a son of John Templeton's well-known dog Roy, and out of Watson's Mossy. first part of the course worked well for this pair, losing very few points right up to the drive. Even on the drive, Pat managed a 106 score out of the possible 160. But then problems in the shedding ring took far too much time, and with one left to shed, he ran out of time, losing any chance at scoring for both the shed and the penning. Norman Davies was the second competitor to run for Wales. In all, Wales had qualified 5 competitors for the final day, and in strong competition with Scotland for the team shield, Wales was needing some good results if they were to beat the 5 Scottish handlers and keep possession of the shield that they had won last year at Alnwick. Norman came to the trial from his farm in North Wales with his 9-year-old Spot. Spot was sired by his own dog Risp, and out of D.G. Roberts' Pat. But things weren't going to go too right for Norman. The start to the outrun needed several whistles to put Spot back to the back of the sheep. Then on the fetch, the ewes went badly offline, missing the gates on their way, eliminating nearly all of Norman's points. Things improved though on the second gather with a better outrun and fetch. Once around the handler, Spot drove the ewes on a high-scoring drive and cross-drive, bringing the sheep back to the shedding ring for a score of 135 out of the possible 160 for the drive. The last part of the run improved his score. He managed the second best shed of the day with steady and precise work, going on to take the pen for a final score of 426. Martin O'Neill, with his 3-year-old laddie, was the 5th to run on the day, and the 2nd for Ireland. Martin had scored a strong 3:21 in the qualifying trials on the Thursday. Unfortunately though, his difficulties at the start of the first outrun, trying to push laddie back to the sheep, proved too much for the day, and so he decided the best thing to do was to retire. Hamish McLean had scored the highest points in the 2 days of qualifying with his 8-year-old Lynn. Hamish, representing Scotland, farms at West Hill in Inverness. His start to the run gave him the best outrun so far in the finals. Unfortunately, his second outrun proved less profitable, with the judges only allowing him 7 points out of the possible 80. He improved his points with an excellent lift and a good second fetch. He finished the course with quite a few problems at the pen, and with only half a minute to go he managed to close the gate. By the end of the run, Hamish had scored 446 points, placing him in second place behind Michael Shearer so far. Aled Owen, the young Welsh farmer from Clwyd, had run 2 dogs on the first day of qualifying. The 323 score with his 9-year-old Ben had been enough to find him a place for the final day. Ben started the run with a good and steady outrun to the back of the sheep, losing only 16 out of the possible 80 points. He went on through the run with no real problems. His second outrun was the most costly part of the course, with several redirections. His second lift only lost him 2 of the 40 points, before going on to a good fetch, drive and shed. Once the 5 sheep had been separated from the 15 unmarked sheep, the pen was immediately and accurately made, with just a minute and a half left before the bell, and with only 1 of the 40 points lost. By the end of the run, Allard had lost 165 points, ending him up with a total score of 515, edging out Hamish McLean for second place so far. Roddy McDermott and Cap had qualified with a high score of 352 on the first day. His 4-year-old Cap is from the breeding of S.N. Wilkins and his 2 dogs Cap and Lynn. Roddy farms in the Candow region of Argyllshire and so competes for the Scottish team.
In fact, Stuart, if this goes on, no way is he going to be. No. If he can go on. As long as you bring them back to the right bit. I don't think that's much. Tremendous technique. And look. And 1 decimal metre up. 1 decimal. He was off a wee bit in the first, maybe 150 yards from in the first day. But let's not find too much fault with us. You're single ahead at the bar, maybe. You never ever got it, did you? The shed might not be this bit. That's one of the same door. That's the same. No, right. Wind's quite a bit. Are you alright, though? That'll be one of the worst bits. Are you alright? No wind there.
Right through the first part of the run, Roddy and Cap scored well, losing only a few points here and there. His two outruns scored well and totalled the highest score so far in the finals. On the second fetch, the sheep ran high and lost 29 of the possible 80 points. Just when the sheep were regathered, the clouds opened and the rest of the run was made in a total downpour. The line on the first part of the drive was off, but in all he had a good cross drive and returned to the shedding ring with only 41 of the 160 points gone. The last part of the course, the shed and the pen scored well, and then with only 30 seconds left, the pen gate closed. This run scored Roddy 526.5 points. The first run after the dinner break was Marion Owen and his father's dog Rock. Unfortunately, Rock ran off the course on the outrun and so Marion retired. Immediately after Marion Owen came Raymond McPherson, running his gunner Katie for the English team. On both of the outruns, Katie ran very slowly and with a number of redirections from Raymond. This was very costly, losing nearly all of the points on the first outrun and nearly 3/4 of them on the second outrun. The drive also proved costly, with the ewes offline to the left on the first part of the drive, and then with 2 ewes missing the gates. The cross drive dropped low off the line, but the gates were negotiated, and then with the ewes going wide before returning to the shedding ring. Eventually, time ran out for Raymond, ending up with a low score of 287. Johnny Wilson and Spot had scored 323 in the second day of qualifying. Spot was sired by Raymond McPherson's Cap, and out of Johnny's own well-known little bitch, Peg. Johnny, who works as a shepherd in the Ashkirk area of Selkirk, managed to win the International Shepherds Championship in 1984, 1986, and then again in 1987.
Funny, like you can see that in any effort of sitting fit in a meeting, so it's like, unless it's going again.
Take you through, you've got better dogs. So many of them got the bus. for that boy here. Tom, what was his name? Right? Little. That's the boy Little's mate of Tuesday, Tom's son. He's only attended that job. Johnny, I forget the name of the place he's at himself, but we see it's at the end of the place. Here, tonight.
It was the strength of Johnny's outfield work that picked up his score so well. His first outrun lost him only 4 of the 80 points, and then his second outrun for the sheep on the right of the course scored the maximum of 80. Both of his lists were decisive and well marked, only losing 6 out of the possible 80 for them both. The drive also scored well, losing only 25 of the 160 points before returning to the shedding ring. The first cut for the shed looked to start Johnny off on a good start, but it wasn't to be. The shed proved quite costly, losing more than half of the points before he went on for a top-scoring pen. The first fetch and then the shed cut down Johnny's score, but the strength of the rest of the run edged him into the lead with a total of 530 points. Bobby Dyell and Wisp had won the International 2 years ago at Margam Park in South Wales. With the last run of the day, he edged out John Templeton and Roy, and at that time Wisp was just 3 years old and running in his first year with Bobby. Bobby and Wisp missed qualifying for the 1990 International at Alnwick, but managed this year for the trial at Carmichael. But with a qualifying score of 318, he had only just managed to squeeze into the final day. Bobby scored fairly well through the first part of the course, losing some points on the outrun with redirections. His real strength came on the drive. Here only 9 of the possible 160 points were lost, with a picture-perfect line and decisive control as Whist walked the sheep through the panels and back to the shedding ring. The efforts in the shedding ring proved fruitless, with the bell ringing and still 2 sheep left to shed. With no points for either the shed or the pen, Bobby and Whist still managed a score of 450, placing him in 5th place behind the Welshman Aled Owen so far in the day. Wilf Reed farms near Monmouth on the English borders of Wales. Running his 5-year-old Sam for the Welsh team, he qualified with a 322 score on the Friday. Sam's breeding goes back to the well-known dog Thomas's Don and to J.J. Reed's Jill. Wilf Reed is no stranger to the national and international trial field. In 1984 he won the Supreme Shield with his well-known dog Turk, a son of his own dog Jasper, an international and national driving champion. At the start of the course, Sam managed a good outrun and fetch, followed by a second excellent outrun, lift and fetch. Up until the start of the drive, Wilf and Sam had the highest score for the earlier part of the course. Once around the handler's post, things started to go downhill. Although the first leg of the drive to the drive panels was only slightly offline, the sheep then ran around the left-hand side of the gates and so losing a lot of points. By the time the sheep had returned to the shedding ring, half of his points were gone for the drive. His shedding work would have scored well, but too much time was taken, and the bell rang before he managed to take off the last of the unmarked sheep. Losing all of the shed and pen score, Wilf dropped from a potentially high score down to 425 and 9th spot with 2 handlers left to run. John Russell had managed a high qualifying score of 362 with his 6-year-old Scott. But the longer outrun on the final day proved too much for them, and so having difficulty in pushing Scott back for the second group of sheep, he decided to retire. The last handler to run was the Irishman John Brennan. John is a part-time farmer and school teacher from Templemore, County Tipperary. With his smooth-coated Meg, he won the 1984 Irish National Championship, and now with Meg's son, Dell, he managed to qualify for the finals at Carmichael, and then going on to the final day and a chance at the Supreme Shield. Right the way through the course, Dell managed to achieve pretty well everything that was expected. On both of the outruns, John had to whistle Dell on, but each time immediately he took the commands. On both of the fetches, Dell managed the fetch gates, but a certain amount of correction was needed on the line on the course. Once again, he managed to negotiate the drive and cross-drive gates, but losing points on the line. The shed caused some problems, but eventually taking the final 4 unmarked sheep in one go, only to run out of time at the pen. John has run for the Irish team on many occasions, and a 7th place for this year's final with a 443 score would have been more than welcome. And so the final day was over. The placings for the Supreme are made on merit points. Starting with the 1991 Supreme Champion, here are the final placings, scores and merit points.